The air in Dust Hollow, Arizona Territory, did not move. It was a solid thing in the summer of 1887, baked hard by a sun that gave no mercy. Red dust, fine as flour, coated everything: the warped boards of the walkways, the drooping leaves of the cottonwoods huddled by the dry creek bed, and the souls of the people who called the town home. It was a place clinging to life by a thread of steel, the new railroad coming through and the distant promise of copper in the hills. For most, life was measured in the space between water barrels and the slow crawl of shadows. May O'Rourke walked through the heat with a purpose that made the dust swirl at her ankles. At 22, she had her mother's straight back and none of her patience. Her face was plain but determined, framed by brown hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes into a permanent state of watchfulness. She stitched clothes for ranchers' wives and set bones for railroad workers when the company doctor was too drunk or too far away. Each coin she earned was a step toward the one thing she wanted: the deed to the small parcel of land her mother had left her. The one with the spring. The only reliable water for miles that was not already owned by a syndicate or a cattle baron. Her destination was the Golden Saguaro Saloon, where the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and failure. It was the office and home of her stepfather, Silas Crowley. He was a prospector who had not found color in a decade, a man whose dreams had long ago dissolved into the bottom of a whiskey glass. She pushed through the swinging doors, letting a wave of heat and blinding sunlight follow her in. The half-dozen men inside blinked at the intrusion. Silas was at the bar, hunched over a drink, his grimy shirt a map of past spills. He saw her reflection in the mirror behind the bar and groaned. "May, to what do I owe this displeasure?" "The deed." "Silas," she said, her voice low and clear, cutting through the low murmur of the saloon. "Mother's deed. I have come for it." He turned on his stool, a wheedling smile on his face that never reached his bloodshot eyes. "Now? May, we have been over this. It is safe. I am keeping it safe for you." "You are keeping it to borrow against," she countered, stepping closer. The men at the tables watched, their curiosity piqued. A disagreement in Dust Hollow was better than any traveling show. "Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile told me you tried to use it for credit again. He said no. I am saying no for the last time. Give it to me." Silas's smile soured. "You have no right to talk to me that way. I raised you." "You existed in the same house I lived in," May corrected him. "Mother raised me. That land was hers, and now it is mine. The law says so." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. The law in this town is about what a man can hold on to. And I have got something better than that old piece of paper." He fumbled inside his coat, his hand shaking, and produced a folded, greasy document. He slammed it on the bar. "I have got your future. All settled." May did not touch it. "What is that?" "A solution," he said, his voice rising with a false heartiness. "A way to clear my debts. A good match for you. Mr. Harrow, the foreman for the railroad, has been very generous. He is willing to take you as his wife, and in return, all my accounts are cleared." The air in the room went still. May felt the blood drain from her face. She looked from the paper to Silas's smug expression. He had not just tried to sell her land. He had sold her. "You cannot do that," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It is done," Silas said, tapping the paper. "A contract, all legal and proper. Sheriff Pike drew it up himself." Something inside May snapped. It was not a loud break, but a quiet, cold severance from the last thread of hope she had held for the man her mother had married. Her hand went to the worn satchel at her hip. It held her mending kit, some bandages, and an old Navy revolver her mother had kept for snakes. Her fingers, usually so steady when setting a stitch or cleaning a wound, trembled as they closed around the wooden grip. She drew the pistol. It felt heavy and foreign in her hand. The saloon went dead quiet. She did not raise it, did not point it at Silas. She held it at her side, the muzzle aimed at the dusty floorboards. It was enough. "You will give me the deed," she said, her voice shaking but hard as stone. "You will tear up that piece of filth. You will do it now." Silas stared at the gun, his face paling. "Put that away, you little fool! Are you crazy?" The saloon doors swung open again, and this time the man who entered was the law. Sheriff Caleb Pike was a big man, his belly straining the buttons of his vest. He had a fat, self-satisfied face and an air of authority that, like Silas's smile, did not seem genuine. "What is all this?" Silas Pike boomed, his eyes flicking from May to the gun and back again. He was enjoying this. Little May causing trouble. "She pulled a gun on me," Silas whined, finding his courage now that the sheriff was here. "I was just telling her the good news about her engagement to Mr. Harrow." "I see," Pike said, stepping toward her. "Well now, May, that is no way to treat your father, and there is no need for firearms. We are all friends here." He reached for the pistol. Before he could take another step, a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "I would not. Sheriff!" Every head turned. Eli Mercer stood there, framed by the harsh afternoon light. He was tall and lean, with the kind of stillness that comes from living in wide-open spaces. His heritage showed in the sharp line of his cheekbones and the dark, steady calm of his eyes. A legacy of his Cherokee mother and Scots father. He owned a horse ranch a few miles out, a place he called Mercer Ranch. He was known as a man who kept to himself, dealt fairly, and had buried his wife 2 years prior after a fever took her. He was now raising his young nephew, Jonah, alone. "Mercer," Pike said, his tone shifting from patronizing to annoyed, "this is not your concern. I came to collect the stud fee Silas owes me for my stallion," Eli said, his gaze not leaving the sheriff, "but it seems I have walked into something else." His eyes met May's for a brief moment. He saw the gun, the fear in her eyes, and the unbroken line of her jaw. He saw a woman cornered. "It is a family matter," Pike blustered. "A marriage contract, all legal. I am just here to see it is honored." He took another step toward May. "Now give me the gun, girl." "She does not look like she wants to be honored," Eli observed calmly. Pike's face flushed a deep red. "Who asked you this girl belongs with Harrow now?" Silas signed the papers. "I belong to myself," May said, her voice finding its strength. "That is not how it works," Pike sneered. He lunged, not for the gun, but for her arm. "You are coming with me." May flinched back, but his meaty hand was fast. Before his fingers could close on her, Eli moved. He was not fast, but deliberate. He stepped from the doorway and simply stood between them. He was not as broad as the sheriff, but he seemed to take up more space. "You are making a scene." "Pike," Eli said. "I am the law," Pike roared. "Are you obstructing me in my duties? You are trying to drag a woman out of a saloon against her will." "I call that kidnapping," Eli said. Pike jabbed a finger at him. "I call it enforcing a contract." "Smells more like enforcing a bottle of whiskey," Eli murmured. A few men at the tables snickered. The sheriff's hand went to the butt of his own pistol. "You are on dangerous ground. Mercer, you and your kind are tolerated here, not welcome to make the rules." Eli's eyes narrowed, the only sign of anger. He paid the insult no mind. His gaze went past Pike. To May. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "My wagon is outside. The circuit judge is due in Prescott in 2 days. If you want to put this before a real court, I will take you there when the sun comes up." It was an offer of nothing more than a ride, a chance. It was not a promise of rescue, only an opportunity for her to continue her own fight on fairer ground. Pike laughed. "She is not going anywhere." He moved to shove Eli aside. But Eli did not move, and May made her choice. While Pike was focused on the man in front of him, she took a step back, then another. She turned and ran for the door. She burst out into the searing sunlight, her heart pounding. There it was, a simple buckboard wagon, a pair of sturdy horses shifting patiently in their harnesses. Pike bellowed from inside the saloon. She did not hesitate. She tossed her satchel onto the wagon seat and scrambled up after it. Grabbing the edge of the seat to steady herself, Eli backed out of the saloon slowly, his eyes still on the furious sheriff. He stepped around the wagon and swung himself up into the driver's seat with an easy, practiced motion. He took the reins. Pike and Silas stumbled out onto the walkway, their faces masks of rage. "You cannot just take her," Silas screamed. "She made a choice," Eli said, his voice even. He did not look at May, but she felt the weight of his presence beside her. A solid wall of quiet resolve. "I will have you arrested for horse theft, for kidnapping," Pike threatened, his hand still on his gun. Eli finally turned his head to look at the sheriff. "You do that. Caleb, you ride out to my ranch and try to arrest me, but you had best be sure the charge is a legal one, because if you ride out on a lie, you might not ride back." He did not need to raise his voice. The threat was as quiet and as real as the heat shimmering off the dusty street. He clucked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward. May looked back at the two men standing in front of the saloon, their forms shrinking in a cloud of red dust. She was shaking, a deep tremor that started in her bones. She was not a prisoner, but she was not free either. She was a passenger in a stranger's wagon, heading toward an unknown future, with nothing to her name but a rusty pistol and a righteous fury. She looked at the man beside her, his hands steady on the reins, his profile etched against the vast, unforgiving sky. He had not touched her, had not even offered a hand to help her into the wagon. He had only offered a choice, and for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost. It was not hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was a chance. And in a land as hard as this, a chance was as precious as water. The ride to Mercer Ranch was silent, save for the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon springs. Dust rose in a fine red plume behind them. A curtain drawing closed on the town of Dust Hollow. May sat straight on the hard wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the borrowed pistol a heavy weight in her satchel. She did not look at the man beside her. She watched the landscape unfold, a vast and thirsty canvas of baked earth, skeletal mesquite trees, and the stoic, armed shapes of saguaro cactus. The sun beat down, and the heat was a physical presence, pressing on her skin. After what felt like an hour, Eli Mercer spoke, his voice as dry as the air. "That ridge ahead, that is the start of my land." May looked. The ridge was a low, rocky spine rising from the flatlands, looking no different from any other piece of this hard country. But to him, it was a boundary, a line between the world that tried to own her and a place she had never seen. The ranch itself was not visible until they were nearly upon it. It was nestled in a shallow basin, a collection of sturdy, unpainted buildings that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. There was a long, low main house with a deep porch, a bunkhouse for the hands, a blacksmith's shed, and a web of corrals holding a dozen fine-looking horses. The place was neat, orderly, and bore the marks of constant, necessary work. Men moved with quiet efficiency, a mix of faces that told the story of the territory. A weathered Mexican vaquero expertly coiled a rope, a young white man barely old enough to grow a beard mucked out a stall, and an older black man with silver in his hair sat mending a harness, his fingers slow but sure. They all looked up as the wagon approached, their gazes curious but respectful. No one called out. Eli pulled the wagon to a halt near a small, separate cabin set a short distance from the main house. "This will be yours," he said, nodding toward it. He swung down from the wagon and tied the reins to a hitching post. He made no move to help her. May climbed down, her legs stiff. The cabin was simple, made of sun-bleached wood with a stone chimney. It was a place of shelter, nothing more. It promised safety, but not comfort. That was more than enough. Eli led her to the door and pushed it open. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with a patched quilt, a small table with one chair, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and an empty fireplace. "It is not much," he said from the doorway. "It is fine," May said, her voice a little hoarse. She stepped inside, the space feeling both vast and small. It was a room of her own, a locked door against the world. "There are rules here." "Miss O'Rourke," Eli said, his tone matter-of-fact. He stood on the threshold, not crossing it. 3 of them. "First, no man on this ranch will lay a hand on you. If they do, they will answer to me, and then they will be gone. Second, you do not owe me anything for this. You are not my guest or my ward. You are a woman seeking the protection of the law, and I am providing a safe place until you can get it. That is all." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers, holding them. "Third, if you choose to work, you will be paid a fair wage. I hear you have some skill with a needle and with medicine. This ranch has need of both. You will earn your keep and be your own woman. Do we have an understanding?" May felt a knot of tension in her shoulders begin to loosen for the first time in years. He was not offering charity. He was offering a contract, as clear and solid as the ground beneath her feet. "Yes, Mr. Mercer," she said, "we do." He gave a single, sharp nod. "There is food in the main house when you are hungry. The privy is out back. The well is over there." He pointed. "The water is low. We do not waste it." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet of the small cabin. The whispers started on the second day. May kept to herself, but she could feel the eyes on her. When she went to the cookhouse to help prepare the midday meal, she heard one of the younger hands mutter to another, "That is Mercer's girl." She kept chopping vegetables, her back straight, her expression unchanged. Another time, as she returned from the well, carefully carrying 2 heavy buckets, she heard the word "water thief" spoken in a low voice from the direction of the bunkhouse. She did not turn her head. She knew that to acknowledge the words would be to give them power. She was here to work, to wait, and to fight for what was hers. The opinions of ignorant men were just more dust in the wind. On the 4th day, the whispers took on a bolder form. A ranch hand named Rufus, a man with shifty eyes and a cruel set to his mouth, cornered her near the stables where she was hanging some mended shirts to air out. "You must be something special," he said, leaning against a post, blocking her path. "For the boss to bring you all the way out here, he must be keeping you warm at night." May clutched her empty mending basket to her chest like a shield. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cold. "I need to pass." Rufus grinned, showing stained teeth. "What is the hurry? We could get to know each other. I can be just as generous as Mercer." "I am not for sale," May said, her eyes flashing. Before Rufus could say another word, Eli's voice cut through the air, sharp and dangerous. "Rufus!" The ranch hand straightened up, the smirk falling from his face. Eli was walking toward them from the main house, his stride long and purposeful. He did not look angry. He looked colder than a winter night. "We were just talking, boss," Rufus stammered. Eli stopped a few feet away. His gaze was fixed on the other man. "You are done talking. You are done working. Pack your things. I want you off my land before sundown." "But I just—" "Now," Eli said. The word was not loud, but it held the finality of a hammer striking an anvil. Rufus paled, shot a hateful glance at May, and scurried away toward the bunkhouse. Eli then turned to May. "Did he touch you?" "No," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He nodded once. He did not apologize for the man's behavior. He did not offer words of comfort. He had stated his rules, and he had enforced them. Nothing more needed to be said. He turned and walked back toward the main house, his actions speaking louder than any words of reassurance ever could. A week passed. May found a rhythm in the life of the ranch. She rose before dawn, helped in the kitchen, and spent hours with her needle and thread, mending the constant rips and tears in the men's work clothes. One afternoon, a horse threw a shoe and tore its hoof on a sharp rock. The animal was in pain, tossing its head and refusing to let anyone near the injured foot. Eli tried to calm it, his voice a low murmur, but the horse was too spooked. "I need someone to hold his head steady," he said to the young hand. "Jimmy, talk to him while I try to clean this out." But Jimmy was nervous, and the horse sensed it. May, watching from the doorway of the barn, stepped forward. "I can do it," she said. Eli looked at her, a question in his eyes. She walked slowly to the horse, not looking at its injury but at its wide, frightened eyes. She began to speak, her voice soft and even, telling it about the time she had found a bird with a broken wing and nursed it back to health. As she spoke, she reached out and gently stroked the horse's neck. The animal's trembling began to subside. Eli watched her, then moved to the horse's foot. "Hold him now," he said. She kept talking, her hands firm and gentle on the horse's head. As Eli worked skillfully to clean the wound and assess the damage, they worked in tandem, a silent team bound by the needs of the animal between them. When he was finished, he straightened up. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he had said it. "You are welcome," she replied, giving the horse a final pat. She turned and walked away, leaving a small, clean linen handkerchief she had used to wipe her hands on a nearby fence post, a quiet, anonymous offering. It was his nephew, Jonah, who became the unlikely bridge between them. The 5-year-old boy was a shadow, always watching from a distance, his eyes large and solemn in his small face. He had his uncle's dark hair and a stillness that was unnatural in a child so young. May saw the grief he carried, a burden too heavy for his small shoulders. One evening, she sat on the step of her cabin, stitching a patch onto the knee of a pair of Jonah's small trousers. The boy crept closer, hiding behind a rain barrel, his curiosity warring with his shyness. He pointed a small, grubby finger at her hand. "You have a mark," he whispered. May looked down at the thin, white scar on her knuckle. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I do. I got it from a barn cat when I was a girl. She had a litter of kittens, and one got stuck in a fence. I was trying to help him, and she thought I was going to hurt him. She did not mean to scratch me. She was just being a mother." Jonah stepped out from behind the barrel. "Did the kitten get out?" "He did," May said. His mother was very happy. From that day on, Jonah was no longer a shadow. He would bring her interesting rocks he found, or ask her to read the labels on sacks of flour, his small finger tracing the letters. He wanted stories, and May, who had never had anyone to tell stories to, found she had a boundless supply of them. Eli would watch from the porch of the main house, a complex expression on his face. He saw the way his nephew's face lit up when May was near, heard the boy's laughter for the first time in months. He found a pair of Jonah's socks on his dresser, neatly darned in a way he could never manage. In the mornings, May would find a canteen of cool water from the spring house sitting on her doorstep, a silent acknowledgement of her place here. One afternoon, as she was mending a heavy canvas tarp, Eli stopped by her cabin. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her fingers work. "You patch that canvas like you are stitching up a side of beef," he remarked, a hint of dry humor in his voice. May did not look up from her work. "A side of beef is more polite than most of the men whose shirts I have been mending," she replied, her own wit just as dry. A small smile touched Eli's lips before he suppressed it. The moment passed, but it left a warmth in the air between them. He was still a man bound by his past, walled off by loss, and she was a woman on guard, wary of any touch, any kindness that might come with a price. But in these small, shared moments, a different kind of currency was being exchanged: respect. The world outside the ranch intruded a few weeks later. One of the older hands, Thomas, returned from a supply run to Dust Hollow. As they sat down for the evening meal, he brought the news. "That railroad foreman, Harrow, is buying up land all along the creek," he said, shaking his head. "And there is talk they are planning to build a dam upriver to make a reservoir for the mine and the railroad." A silence fell over the table. A dam would cut off the water that fed the entire basin. It would turn Mercer Ranch, and every other small holding downstream into a dust bowl. "That is not all," Thomas continued, looking at Eli. "Sheriff Pike is going around saying he has been ordered to do a new survey of all the property lines to clarify the water rights." May's hands froze. A forkful of beans halfway to her mouth, her small plot of land, the land with her mother's spring, was on that creek. Silas's illegal contract with Harrow suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It was not about her. It was about her water. Eli's face was grim. He looked across the table at May, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own resolve. Her fight was no longer just about a deed and a piece of her past. His fight was no longer just about his ranch and his future. Their struggles had flowed together, becoming one, and Jonah, sitting between them, looked from one serious adult face to the other. "May," he whispered, "will you tell me a story after supper?" His small voice cut through the tension. May looked down at him and managed a smile. "Of course," she said. "I will." Her goal was clear. She would get her land back. Eli's goal was clear. He would protect his water, and Jonah's goal was simplest of all. He just wanted someone to tell him a story before he fell asleep. In the face of the coming storm, it was the most important promise of all. The days that followed settled into a grim routine, dictated by the sun and the dwindling water. A hot wind blew relentlessly from the south, carrying with it a haze of fine dust that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. The cattle grew leaner, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides. At night, the distant, hungry howls of a coyote pack served as a constant reminder that, in this land, weakness was a death sentence. The men of the Mercer Ranch took turns standing watch over the precious flow of spring mercy, their faces drawn and tired from lack of sleep. One evening, May sat on the porch of the main house, a small whittling knife in her hand. She was not carving wood, but carefully cleaning the grime from the handle of an old dinner knife. The silver was worn thin, but an elegant, looping in for Eleanor was still visible. Jonah sat beside her, tracing the letter with his finger. "Was that your mamma's?" he asked in a small voice. "It was," May said softly. "It is the only thing of hers I have left, besides the land." Eli came out onto the porch, moving with the quiet tread of a man who preferred not to be noticed. He stopped, seeing the knife in her hand and the somber look on her face. He did not speak, but leaned against a post, his presence a silent invitation for her to continue if she wished. "My mother was a healer," May said, her voice barely a whisper, speaking more to the memory than to the man and the boy beside her. She knew more about setting bones and stitching wounds than any doctor in the territory. She had a full set of medical instruments, polished steel and everything. "When I was born, something went wrong. A fever. The town doctor was too late." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "After she was gone, Silas sold it all. Her instruments, her books, everything. For whiskey money. I was 6. I hid this one knife under a loose floorboard so he could not sell it too." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her loss. Jonah leaned his small body against her arm in a simple, profound gesture of comfort. After a long moment, Eli spoke, his own voice rough with an old pain. "My wife, Sarah, she died of scarlet fever. It came on fast. By the time I rode for the doctor, it was already too late. I should not have left her." He looked out into the gathering darkness, his jaw tight. "There was not a thing I could do. A man can fight off rustlers or wolves. He can build a house and dig a well, but against a fever, you are helpless. You just have to watch." In that shared confession of helplessness, a fragile bridge was built between them. They were two people marked by the same kind of loss, the kind that leaves you afraid to hold on to anything too tightly, for fear it will be snatched away. The next day, as if the world knew they needed a respite from the gloom, the oppressive wind died down. In the quiet stillness of the afternoon, May found Jonah sitting on the floor of the cookhouse, looking intently at a large sack of flour. "What are you doing?" she asked, a smile touching her lips. "Trying to make the pictures talk," he said, pointing at the bold black letters on the sack. May sat down on the floor beside him. "They are not pictures, they are letters, and if you put them together, they make words. See?" She pointed. "This one is an F. It makes off sound, like a cat when it is mad. And this one is an L. Your tongue touches the top of your mouth. Ah." For the next hour, the Mercer Ranch cookhouse became a schoolroom. May, with a patience she did not know she possessed, pointed out letters and sounded out words, her student repeating them with solemn concentration. Flour, salt, sugar. Eli walked in to find them there, heads bent together over the sack. He stopped in the doorway, and for a moment, the weary lines around his eyes softened. He saw not a woman he was sheltering, but a teacher. He saw not a grieving nephew, but a small boy learning about the world. He saw something that looked dangerously like a family. Later that week, he tried to repay the kindness in the only way he knew how. With May and Jonah both busy, he decided he would cook the evening meal himself. He found a sack of dried beans in a large pot and set to work with a determined, if clumsy, air. An hour later, a smell of acrid smoke filled the air. May and Jonah ran to the main house to find Eli standing on the porch, coughing and waving a dish towel at the black smoke pouring out of the kitchen door. Inside, the pot of beans was a charred, blackened ruin. Eli looked at the pot, then at their wide, shocked faces. A slow flush crept up his neck. "I believe I may have used too much fire," he admitted sheepishly. Jonah looked at the smoking pot, then at his uncle's soot-smudged face, and a giggle escaped him. Then another. Soon he was laughing, a pure, delighted sound that echoed in the quiet yard. May tried to suppress her own smile, but failed. She started to laugh too, a genuine, unburdened laugh that made her feel lighter than she had in years. Eli looked at them, and after a moment's hesitation, a deep chuckle rumbled in his chest. The three of them stood there, covered in a light dusting of smoke and failure, and laughed until tears streamed down their faces. It was the first time they had all laughed together. The laughter did not last. The following week, Thomas returned from another trip to town, his face a thundercloud. He found Eli and May near the corral, inspecting a new foal. "I have bad news," he said, dismounting from his horse. "That stepfather of yours, May, he has done it now. He sold a copy of your mother's deed to Harrow, swore it was the original. Pike backed him up, filed the paperwork and everything. They are calling it a civil dispute over a contested claim. Said the court will have to sort it out." The air went cold. A copy, a forgery. It was a tangle of lies designed to mire her claim in legal battles she could not afford, to delay until the railroad's dam was a fact on the ground and her water rights were worthless. "The whole town is on edge," Thomas went on, shaking his head. "Most folks know it is crooked, but no one wants to cross Harrow and the railroad. They are siding with the power." That night, May lay on her cot, staring at the wooden ceiling of her cabin. She felt a familiar, sickening guilt creep over her. She had brought this trouble to Eli's door. His ranch, his livelihood, was now threatened because he had offered her a moment of safety. Was she using him? Was her fight for justice going to cost this good man everything he had worked for? She resolved to keep more of a distance, to not be a burden, to be nothing more than the paid hand she had agreed to be. Across the yard, Eli stood on his porch, watching the faint light in her cabin window. He knew what the town would be saying. They would twist his actions, paint her as a woman of loose morals, and him as a fool. He felt a fierce, protective anger rise in him, a desire to shield her from the ugliness of the world. But he knew that any overt gesture of protection would only feed the gossip, would only hurt her more. He, too, decided that a careful distance was the only honorable path. The next few days were marked by a polite, careful reserve. They worked together when necessary, their conversations limited to the tasks at hand. The easy camaraderie they had begun to build was replaced by a quiet, shared tension. They were hauling water from the spring house, the deepest and coolest source, reserved for the house and the horses. The work was hard, a seemingly endless chain of passing heavy wooden buckets. As May reached for a full bucket he was handing up, her fingers brushed against his. It was nothing, a fleeting contact of skin on skin, but it felt like a bolt of lightning in the dry, charged air. A sudden, shocking warmth. May drew in a sharp breath. Eli pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, his knuckles white where he gripped the handle of the next bucket. He turned his face away, but not before she saw the conflict in his eyes. May looked down at her own hands, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. She understood. The boundary was still there, a line drawn by loss and duty and the harsh realities of their world. It was a line of respect, and for now, that had to be enough. At the end of the week, Eli approached her as she was finishing her mending. He held out a small, leather-bound ledger and a pen. "Your wages," he said, his voice formal. He opened the book. On the page, he had neatly listed her work mending, medical care for the horse, helping in the kitchen. At the bottom was a sum of money. "If you will sign here," he said, pointing to a line at the bottom. May took the pen. Her signature, clear and steady, was an affirmation. She was not a charity case. She was not a dependent. She was May O'Rourke, an employee, earning her own way. It was a small thing, but it felt like a restoration of dignity. It was his way of telling her that he saw her as an equal. She handed the book back to him. "Thank you, Eli." It was the first time she had used his given name. "You earned it, May," he replied, his own use of her name a quiet acknowledgement. "This business with the deed," she began, her voice gaining a new resolve. "We cannot let them win." "We will not," he said. "We cannot fight them with guns, and we cannot trust the law in Dust Hollow. But the circuit judge is an honest man. We need to build a case, a proper one." "But how?" she asked. "It is my word against theirs. And they have a piece of paper." "We need to prove their paper is a lie," he said, his mind clearly working. "We need to prove your claim is the original, and we do that by proving your stepfather is a liar and a forger." He looked at her. "We need to find anything he has ever signed. Old receipts, letters, promissory notes. We need to collect his signature, as many as we can find, to prove the one on your mother's true deed is his, and the one on Harrow's is not. A plan. It was a fragile, difficult plan. But it was a plan nonetheless, a spark of hope, small but persistent, ignited within her. They stood there on the dusty ground, the ledger book a symbol of their strange partnership. They were not allies in a romantic sense, but in a deeper one. They were two solitary people, bound by a shared fight for the one thing that mattered in this unforgiving land, the right to exist, on their own terms, on their own land. The invasion came not with guns, but with wooden stakes. One morning, a wagon appeared on the ridge, carrying 3 men May had never seen before. They were not ranchers. They wore city clothes, now powdered with dust, and carried tripods and measuring chains. They worked with an impersonal efficiency, driving sharpened oak stakes into the hard-baked soil, the rhythmic thud of their mallets a slow, steady heartbeat of theft. They were marking the land, claiming it with geometry and industry. They were mapping the path to the water. Eli stood on the porch of the main house, watching them, his body as still as the mountains on the horizon. His hands were loose at his sides, but May could see the corded muscle in his jaw working. His men had gathered, their faces dark and angry, murmuring among themselves. "Just say the word, boss," one of them said, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip. "There is no word," Eli said, his voice flat. "They have a right to survey. We have no right to stop them. Not yet." By midday, the line of stakes had crept down from the ridge and was approaching the green ribbon of trees that marked the course of the creek. A second wagon arrived, this one carrying Sheriff Caleb Pike and the railroad foreman, Mr. Harrow. Harrow was a man built of soft living and hard money. his expensive suit looking ridiculous in the blistering sun. Pike, however, looked perfectly at home. He swaggered toward the porch, waving a piece of paper. "Mercer," he called out, his voice slick with false authority. "I have an order here from the Territorial Office, a temporary injunction of management for the disputed waterway, pending a full hearing. These men are under my protection." Eli walked down the steps to meet him, his movements deliberate. May followed a few paces behind, her heart hammering against her ribs. She would not hide. This was her fight as much as his. "An injunction based on a fraudulent document," Eli stated, his eyes on the paper in Pike's hand. Harrow stepped forward, a condescending smile on his face. "That is for the court to decide. Until then, the railroad has a vested interest in this water source, an interest backed by a signed contract. We are merely taking steps to secure our investment." "My mother's will grants me sole title to that spring," May said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. She was trembling, but she would not let them see it. Under territorial law, a wife's inheritance cannot be sold by her husband. Harrow and Pike both turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and amusement. A few of Harrow's surveyors snickered. "The little lady thinks she is a lawyer," Harrow said to Pike, loud enough for all to hear. The laughter grew. The sound was like a physical blow. May flinched, the color draining from her face. She felt the eyes of the entire ranch on her, felt the weight of their world pressing in. In that moment, Eli shifted his position slightly. It was a small, almost unnoticeable movement, but he now stood between her and the cold wind that had begun to blow from the north. He did not look at her, did not touch her, but she felt the solidness of his presence, a silent shield against the world's scorn. He wanted to reach for her. She knew it instinctively. He wanted to put a hand on her shoulder, to pull her behind him, to do all the things a man was supposed to do, but he did not. Instead, he simply blocked the wind. "She has stated her claim," Eli said, his voice cutting through the laughter, "and it will be heard by the circuit judge. Until that day, you can plant your sticks. But if a single one of them is hammered into the bed of that creek, I will consider it a trespass. Is that understood, Sheriff?" Pike's face purpled. "You are threatening me, Mercer." "I am stating a boundary," Eli corrected him. "Something you and your friends seem to have trouble understanding." He turned and walked back to the house, leaving no room for argument. May followed, her head held high. As she passed the small group of onlookers from town who had gathered to watch the spectacle, she caught the eye of Mrs. Gable, the owner of the mercantile. The older woman was a stern, no-nonsense widow who rarely smiled, but as their eyes met, Mrs. Gable gave May a small, almost imperceptible nod of support. It was a flicker of light in a dark day. Later that week, May rode into Dust Hollow for supplies. She needed thread, and she wanted to speak to Mrs. Gable privately. As she was tying her horse to the hitching post outside the mercantile, a voice she dreaded called her name. "May, girl, wait a moment." Silas Crowley hurried toward her, his face a mask of false concern. He was freshly shaved and wore a shirt that was only slightly stained. Harrow's money was already at work. "I heard what happened out at the ranch," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "It is a terrible business. I never wanted it to go this way." "Then you should not have sold a fraudulent deed," May said, her voice like ice. "It was for survival," he whined, his eyes shifting nervously. "Harrow had me in a corner, but there is a way to make it right. For both of us." He fumbled in his pocket. "He just needs you to sign this. It is a document, a simple confirmation that you renounce any claim. He said he would pay you for it, a gesture of goodwill, enough to get you started somewhere new. California. Maybe." May looked at the paper, then at the desperate, weak face of the man who had raised her. He was asking her to sign away her mother's legacy, her one true possession, for a handful of silver. "No," she said. "May, be reasonable." "I said no," she repeated, her voice rising. "Was my mother's memory not enough for you to drink away? Now you want to sell my future too. Get away from me. Silas?" Her raised voice attracted attention. People on the boardwalk stopped to stare. The conflict she had tried to keep private was now a public spectacle. Silas's face crumpled into a mask of self-pity and rage. "You ungrateful girl," he spat. "After everything I have done for you, you will regret this. You will come crawling back when that half-breed rancher of yours throws you out." He stormed off toward the saloon, leaving May standing alone in a sea of judging eyes. She could hear the whispers starting. The same old poison. She saw the Reverend pass by on the other side of the street, his gaze fixed determinedly on the church steeple, a sermon on public order and decency already forming in his mind. The town was closing ranks, siding with the money and the power, and she was on the outside. Shaking with a mixture of anger and humiliation, she turned to go into the mercantile when a sudden cry of pain and a crash of splintering wood came from further down the street, near the railroad construction site. A crowd was gathering, pushing her own troubles aside. May hurried toward the commotion. A young man in work clothes lay on the ground, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His arm was bent at an unnatural angle, a piece of white bone visible through a tear in his bloody sleeve. A heavy timber had fallen from a half-finished structure. "Give him air," May commanded, pushing her way through the gawking onlookers. She knelt beside the injured man, her touch gentle but firm. "What is your name?" "Patrick," he gasped, his eyes wide with pain. "All right, Patrick, your arm is broken. I'm going to set it, but I need you to stay as still as you can." She worked quickly, tearing a strip from her petticoat to make a clean bandage and looking around for a splint. The railroad foreman, Harrow, stood nearby, his face impassive. He saw only a delay in his work schedule. May found 2 flat pieces of wood from the wreckage and, with the help of another worker, carefully straightened the young man's arm and bound it tightly. Throughout the ordeal, Patrick's eyes never left her face. When she was done, he whispered, "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you." He was one of the men who had been laughing at her just days before. As the other workers prepared to carry him to the company doctor's office, Patrick grabbed her sleeve. "Wait!" he hissed, his voice low and urgent. He glanced nervously at Harrow, who was busy yelling at another man. "That sheriff, Pike, he is dirtier than a pig in mud. He keeps a book, a little black ledger, writes down every bribe Harrow pays him. I have seen it. He keeps it in the bottom drawer of his desk, under a stack of old wanted posters." He let go of her arm, his warning delivered. May stared at him, her heart beginning to pound again, but for a different reason. A black ledger. It was the kind of proof that could bring the whole corrupt structure tumbling down. She spent the afternoon with Mrs. Gable in the back room of the mercantile, the scent of cinnamon and dried beans in the air. The widow listened to her story, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. "I knew Silas was a scoundrel, but this is a new low," she said, her voice crisp. She opened a large, dusty account book. "I never gave him credit, but I did buy a few of your mother's remedies from him, years ago. After she passed, he was desperate for cash. He wrote me a receipt for them." She flipped through the brittle pages. "Here it is." She pointed to a line of faded ink, a list of herbs, a price, and at the bottom, the signature Silas Crowley. It was shaky, but it was his. "Keep this," May said. "It is safer with you." Mrs. Gable nodded, tearing the page carefully from the book and folding it. "That man Mercer," she said, her sharp eyes studying May's face. "He is a good man, quiet, but you can see the steel in him. You are safe with him." On the ride back to the ranch, May felt the weight of the day settle on her. The public humiliation, the ugly confrontation with Silas, but also the whispered secret from the injured worker and the quiet solidarity of Mrs. Gable. The world was not entirely against her. She found Eli by the corral, replacing a rotted post. He worked with a steady, rhythmic economy of motion, his shoulders and back moving smoothly. He looked up as she approached, his face unreadable. She told him everything. About Silas's offer, about the scene in the street, about the injured worker, and about the black ledger. He listened without interruption, his hands never ceasing their work. When she was finished, he drove a final nail into the post with 2 clean, powerful strokes. "A ledger," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That is a dangerous thing to know about." "But it is the proof we need," she insisted. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it is the kind of thing that gets a person killed." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of raw fear in his eyes. It was not for himself, it was for her. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Eli found Rufus, the man he had fired, drinking at the small, makeshift saloon that served the railroad workers at their camp. Rufus had been spreading stories, ugly lies about May and Eli, poisoning the well of public opinion. Eli did not raise his voice. He did not issue a threat. He simply stood before the man and said, "I hear you have been talking. You need to understand something. The Mercer name still means something in this valley. You will find no work at any ranch from here to the mountains. You will not be hired to sweep the floor in a Prescott saloon. You are finished here. I suggest you take the next train east." He turned and walked away, leaving Rufus staring into his whiskey glass, his face the color of ash. Eli had drawn another boundary, a wider one, protecting not just his land, but his and May's honor. With the quiet power of his name, the world was tightening its grip, but they were beginning to push back. They had a receipt, the knowledge of a ledger, and an alliance forged in a dusty storeroom. It was not much, but it was a start. It was a weapon. The sky turned yellow first, a sick jaundiced color that bled across the horizon, choking the blue. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath for weeks, fell away into an unnerving silence. The horses in the corral grew restless, stamping their feet and snorting at the strange, oppressive stillness. The air grew thick, heavy, making each breath a conscious effort. Then the dust came. It was not a storm so much as a moving wall, a solid mass of red earth that rose from the flatlands and consumed the world. It blotted out the sun, plunging the afternoon into a surreal twilight. The wind returned with a vengeance, howling like a banshee, driving the grit into every crack and crevice. It was a physical assault, blinding and suffocating. Inside the main house, May and Eli worked with a practiced urgency, stuffing rags into the gaps around the windows and doors. Jonah, his face smudged with dirt and fear, helped by bringing them strips of cloth, his small body a tense knot of anxiety. The roar of the wind was deafening, and the house groaned under the strain. The dust storm raged for an hour, an eternity of darkness and noise. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind died. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. And then came the first drop of rain. It struck the tin roof with a sound like a gunshot. Another followed, and another, until the singular impacts merged into a steady, drumming roar. Eli pulled the rags from a window and looked out. The air was a thick, red soup of mud, the rain scouring the dust from the sky. "It is going to flash," he said, his voice grim. "The ground is too hard to soak it up. The arroyos will run. We need to get the horses on the high ground behind the barn." He pulled on a heavy slicker and headed for the door. "Stay inside," he commanded May and Jonah. But Jonah, who had been cooped up and frightened for hours, saw his chance to be a man, to help his uncle. As Eli ran toward the main corral, Jonah slipped out the back door, intent on helping with the mares in the smaller pasture near the dry creek bed. May saw him go. "Jonah, no!" she cried, but her voice was swallowed by the deluge. She grabbed her own worn coat and ran out after him, the cold rain soaking her in seconds. By the time she reached the pasture, Eli was already there, fighting to get the gate open against a growing current of muddy water. The dry arroyo, A dusty scar on the landscape moments before was now a churning, brown river. Jonah, small and determined, was trying to shoo a frightened mare and her foal away from the rising water. The foal, spooked by the thunder and the flood, refused to cross a small gully that was rapidly filling with water. "Jonah, get back!" Eli yelled, his voice raw with terror. The boy, seeing the fear in his uncle's face, finally turned to run back, but it was too late. The gully between him and the safety of the main pasture was now a torrent, 4 feet wide and getting wider by the second. He was trapped on a small, shrinking island of high ground. May's heart seized. She saw the boy's small, terrified face, and the past and present collided in a wave of cold dread. Another person she cared for was in danger, and she was helpless. But this time, she was not. She ran to the barn, her mind racing. Ropes. They needed a rope. She found a long, thick coil of new lariat rope, the kind Eli used for breaking strong horses. She ran back out into the storm, the heavy rope slung over her shoulder. Eli saw her coming. "What are you doing?" he shouted over the roar of the water. "There is no time to go around," she yelled back, her words whipped away by the wind. "You hold one end. I will go across." "No," he said, his face a mask of disbelief. "It is too dangerous. I will do it." "You are not light enough," she countered, her voice sharp with an authority he had never heard before. "And you are needed to hold the anchor. Tie it around that post. I will tie the other end around my waist. You play it out. And you pull us in. Both of us." He hesitated for only a second, his protective instincts warring with the undeniable logic of her plan. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile woman, but a partner. He saw the same steel he had seen in the saloon, the same steady resolve he had seen when she held his spooked horse. He nodded, his face grim. "All right." She worked quickly, her fingers, so adept at fine stitches, now tying a secure bowline knot around her waist. Eli wrapped the other end of the rope around a thick fence post, bracing himself, his feet planted wide in the sucking mud. "I am ready," she called. Taking a deep breath, May waded into the churning water. It was colder than ice, and the current was a powerful, living thing, pulling at her legs, trying to drag her downstream. The water rose to her waist, then her chest. She kept her eyes fixed on Jonah's small, pale face. She could feel the steady tension on the rope, a lifeline connecting her to the solid, unmoving presence of the man on the bank. She reached the other side, gasping, and scrambled up the muddy bank. Jonah ran into her arms, burying his face in her wet coat, his small body trembling violently. "It is all right," she murmured, holding him tight. "We are going back now." She adjusted the rope, holding Jonah in front of her. "Hold on to me as tight as you can." She yelled to Eli, "Pull!" The rope grew taut, slowly, painstakingly. He began to pull them through the flood. The water fought them for every inch. A floating log slammed into May's side, and she cried out, nearly losing her footing, but the rope held. Eli's strength held. She could feel his power flowing through that length of rope, a tangible connection of will and muscle. Finally, her feet touched the solid ground of the near bank. 2 of the ranch hands, who had seen the drama unfolding, ran to help, pulling her and the sobbing boy from the water's edge. May collapsed onto the muddy ground, her lungs burning, her body scraped and bruised. Eli was there in an instant, untying the rope from her waist, his hands shaking. He scooped Jonah up into his arms, holding the boy so tightly it seemed he was trying to merge them into one person. He looked at May, his eyes dark with a tumult of emotions, terror, relief, and a profound, bone-deep gratitude that left him speechless. "The old line cabin," one of the hands said. "It is the closest shelter." Eli nodded. Still holding Jonah, he started toward the small, sturdy wooden shed on a rise of ground 50 yards away. May pushed herself to her feet, every muscle aching, and followed him. The world a dizzying blur of gray rain and brown mud. Inside the cabin, the roar of the storm was muted to a dull drumming on the roof. It was a single, small room, smelling of old wood smoke and damp earth. Eli set Jonah down and immediately began stripping off the boy's soaked clothes, his movements rough with urgency. He took off his own heavy canvas coat and wrapped it around Jonah's shivering body, then sat the boy near the cold fireplace, chafing his hands and feet. May leaned against the wall, her teeth chattering, water dripping from her hair and clothes to form a puddle on the floor. She watched Eli's frantic care of his nephew, and a strange, watery smile touched her lips. "You know," she said, her voice trembling with cold, "you are shivering more than he is." Eli stopped, looking down at his own hands, which were indeed shaking uncontrollably. He looked at her, at the scrape on her cheek where a piece of debris had hit her, at the way her wet dress clung to her, at the sheer, unyielding courage in her eyes. The adrenaline of the crisis was fading, leaving behind something else, something raw and potent and dangerous. The small, dark space felt suddenly charged, the air thick with unspoken things. He saw a long, angry red scratch on her shoulder, just below the collar of her dress, where the rope had chafed her skin. "You are hurt," he said, his voice husky. He took a step toward her, his hand automatically reaching for the small first aid kit that was always kept on a shelf in the line cabins. He intended only to clean the wound, to offer the same practical care he would to any injured person or animal on his ranch. As his fingers came near her shoulder, May flinched, a small, involuntary movement. She did not pull away. She just looked at him, her eyes wide. "You ain't supposed to touch me," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, a fragile, trembling thread. It was not an accusation. It was not a rejection. It was a reminder, a statement of a promise made and a boundary kept. It was an admission of fear, not of him, but of the powerful, unknown territory they were standing on the edge of. Eli froze, his hand hovering in the space between them. He let it drop to his side. His gaze did not leave hers. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging in the quiet of the small room. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the same war of duty and desire that was tearing him apart. He could feel the warmth of her breath, could smell the rain in her hair. He took a half-step back, honoring the space she had claimed. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low murmur, a sound meant only for her. "Then stop looking at me like that." A shaky laugh, half a sob, escaped her lips. His words were not a demand, but a confession, a shared admission of the impossible current flowing between them. A small smile touched his own mouth, a flicker of warmth in the cold room. They had faced the flood, and now they faced this. And for a moment, they simply stood there, breathing, acknowledging the truth without surrendering to it. The boundary had been tested, and it had held. Respect, for now, was stronger than the storm. A small, sleepy voice piped up from the bundle of coats by the hearth. "You two are whispering like pigeons." Jonah, his shivering finally subsided, was watching them from his cocoon, his eyes heavy with sleep. The tension in the room broke. May let out a real, quiet laugh this time, and the color returned to her cheeks. Eli ran a hand through his wet hair, a gesture of profound relief. The child, in his innocence, had pulled them back from the precipice. He had reminded them of why they were here, of the larger responsibilities that bound them. May was a woman fighting for her rights, not a conquest. Eli was a guardian, not a suitor. And together, they were the unlikely protectors of a small boy who needed them both. The rain had washed the dust from the world, and in the clean, quiet air that remained, a new and fragile hope began to take root. The rain washed the world clean, but it left behind a thick blanket of mud that clung to boots and wagon wheels, making every task twice as hard. The flash flood had receded as quickly as it had come, leaving the creek bed scoured and the air smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. In the week that followed, a fragile sense of normalcy returned to the Mercer Ranch. The near tragedy had forged a new, unspoken bond between the three inhabitants of the main house. They moved around each other with a quiet awareness, a shared memory of the rope, the flood, and the whispered words in the line cabin. One afternoon, a lone rider approached the ranch. It was Patrick, the young railroad worker whose arm May had set. He was pale and his arm was bound in a clean splint, but he sat tall in the saddle. He dismounted awkwardly and asked to speak with May. She met him on the porch, offering him a dipper of cool water. "It is good to see you on your feet, Patrick," she said kindly. "I had to thank you, ma'am," he said, his young face earnest. "The company doctor said you did a fine job. Said you saved me from losing the use of it." He drank the water gratefully, his eyes darting around the ranch yard, ensuring they were alone. "But that is not the only reason I came." He reached inside his shirt with his good hand and pulled out a small, oilcloth-wrapped package. He pressed it into her hand. It was thin, rectangular, and surprisingly heavy. "I could not sleep, knowing what they did to you," he whispered, his voice hurried. "Knowing what they are trying to do. I went back to the office late last night, told the night watchman I left my pay packet behind. This is it, the ledger." May's fingers tightened around the package. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. "You have to be careful," Patrick said, his eyes wide with the gravity of his actions. "Pike finds out I took this. He will see me buried in a ditch somewhere between here and Tucson. I am riding out today, not stopping till I reach California." He backed away toward his horse. "You are a good woman, Miss O'Rourke. I hope you get what is yours." He swung himself into the saddle and rode away without looking back, a young man fleeing the corruption that had nearly crippled him. May stood on the porch, the small, black book, a dangerous weight in her hand. Later, in the privacy of her cabin, she unwrapped it. The ledger was filled with Caleb Pike's spidery, self-important script. It was a meticulous record of greed dates, names, and figures. Harrow's name appeared on every other page, next to sums of money paid for surveying fees, legal consultations, and equipment acquisition. It was damning. It was proof that the law in Dust Hollow was for sale, but it was not proof that her land belonged to her. She knew what she needed. The ledger could bring down Pike, but only a legitimate document could defeat Harrow's claim. She needed something with Silas's true signature. Something from a time before he had started selling off his soul piece by piece. She thought of the worn dinner knife, of her mother's things. Silas had a trunk, a battered old thing he dragged with him from one failed mining camp to the next. It held all his worldly possessions. If there was anything left from her mother's life, anything he had not yet sold, it would be in there. She had to go to his camp. She told Eli she needed to ride to the mercantile for more thread, a lie that felt clumsy on her tongue. He accepted it without question, though she saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. He did not ask, and she did not explain. This was a piece of her past she had to face alone. Silas's latest home was a miserable shack patched together from scavenged lumber and canvas. Huddled with a dozen others in the shadow of a played-out copper mine, the place smelled of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and despair. She found his shack empty, the door held shut with a loop of rope. She slipped the rope off and stepped inside. The single room was a disaster of filth and neglect. Dirty clothes, empty bottles, and old prospecting tools were strewn everywhere. The air was thick and sour. In the corner sat the trunk. It was not even locked. She lifted the heavy lid, a plume of musty air rising to meet her. Inside was a tangle of his life-yellowed claim maps for worthless land, a few chipped geological samples, a pair of worn-out boots. Her heart sank. Then, at the very bottom, beneath a moth-eaten blanket, she felt a small, leather portfolio. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out. It contained her mother's papers, not deeds or legal documents, but the quiet records of a life. pressed flowers, a few tintype photographs, and a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. One letter caught her eye. It was from her mother to her sister back east, written shortly after May was born. It was a happy, hopeful letter, filled with plans for the future. And at the bottom, beneath her mother's signature, was another. Witnessed in good health and sound mind, this day, by your friend, Silas Crowley. His signature, it was clear, firm, written by a man who had not yet been hollowed out by failure. It was nothing like the shaky, blotted signature on the receipt Mrs. Gable held, and even less like the forgery he must have created for Harrow. Beside his signature was another, that of a second witness, Dr. Martin Thompson, the physician who had delivered her, a man who had died a decade ago, but whose reputation for honesty was still remembered in the territory. This was it. This was the key. Clutching the portfolio to her chest, she fled the squalid shack, mounted her horse, and urged it toward the ranch, toward safety. She was halfway home when they appeared. Two men, deputies by the tarnished stars on their vests, rode out from a rocky outcropping, blocking her path. She recognized them as Pike's men, hard cases who did his dirty work. "Miss O'Rourke," one of them said, a lazy grin on his face. "The sheriff wants a word with you." "I have no business with the sheriff," she said, pulling her horse to a halt. "Oh, I think you do," the other man said. "There is talk of threats. A certain railroad worker has disappeared. The sheriff is concerned for your safety. He has ordered us to place you in protective custody." The words were a mockery, a cold veil for their true intent. "I do not need your protection," she said, her hand inching toward her satchel, where the old revolver lay. The first deputy's grin vanished. That was not a request. He urged his horse forward, grabbing her reins before she could react. "You will come with us, nice and quiet." Word reached the ranch an hour later. Young Jimmy, out checking fence lines, had seen it from a distant ridge. He rode back at a full gallop, his horse lathered, his face pale with alarm. Eli was in the blacksmith's shed, hammering a new shoe into shape. When Jimmy burst in, he listened to the boy's frantic report, his hand tightening on the hammer until his knuckles were white. The fire in the forge seemed to dim, the world narrowing to a single, terrifying point. Sarah, dying in their bed. May, taken on the open road. The old, cold fear of helplessness rose up in him, a bitter taste in his mouth. He wanted to saddle his fastest horse, to take his rifle, to ride into Dust Hollow and tear the jailhouse apart with his bare hands. But he did not. He placed the hammer carefully back on the anvil. He took a long, slow breath, banking the fire of his rage. Violence was Pike's game, played by Pike's rules. He would not win that way. He would lose everything. He walked out into the yard and called his most trusted men to him. Then he sent Jimmy to ride into town, not to the saloon or the sheriff's office, but to the mercantile and the small house behind the church. Within the hour, Mrs. Gable and the elderly Reverend Michael were at the ranch. They gathered in the main house, their faces grim. With them was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He wore a dusty coat and a pistol strapped high on his hip. Marshal John Thompson, on his way to Prescott, had been taking his supper in the back of Mrs. Gable's store when Jimmy had arrived. Eli laid out the situation with a cold, clear logic, his voice devoid of emotion. He spoke of the deed, the injunction, and now the abduction. He did not speak of the ledger or the letter. He held his evidence close. "Pike has overplayed his hand," the marshal said when Eli was finished. "Taking her under false pretenses is a federal crime, but he will have a story cooked up. We need to approach this carefully." "We will," Eli said. He turned to the small group. "We ride tonight." As they prepared to leave, a small figure appeared in the doorway. It was Jonah. "I am coming," he said, his small jaw set. "No, Jonah," Eli said gently. "You will stay here. It is not safe." I know a way, the boy insisted. A shortcut, the old cattle trail through the wash. It comes out behind the livery stable. They will not see us coming. Eli looked at the boy, at his fierce, determined expression. Jonah was not just offering a path. He was offering his help, his courage. He was trying to bring May home. All right, Eli said. You can ride with me, but you will do exactly as I say. They rode in darkness, a small, silent posse moving through the night. The air was cool and smelled of damp sage and the faint, metallic tang of rust from the railroad tracks. The horses' hooves made soft thuds in the sandy soil, their breath pluming in the faint moonlight. Eli rode at the head of the group, Marshal Thompson beside him. Jonah seated securely in front of him. He felt the old fear clawing at him, the fear of loss, of being too late, but he pushed it down, focusing on the quiet confidence of the marshal, the steady presence of his men, and the small, warm body of his nephew pressed against him. They emerged from the wash into the back alleys of Dust Hollow, silent as ghosts. They dismounted, leaving the horses with one of the hands. Eli lit a single storm lantern, its steady, clean light a stark contrast to the flickering, greasy lamps of the saloons. They walked to the front of the sheriff's office. Pike was inside, leaning back in his chair, his feet on his desk. He looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and anger, as Eli and the marshal entered. "Mercer," he snarled, swinging his feet to the floor. "What is the meaning of this? You are trespassing." "I have come for Miss O'Rourke," Eli said, his voice level. "She is a material witness, in protective custody," Pike blustered. Marshal Thompson stepped forward, the lantern light glinting on the silver star pinned to his coat. "Marshal John Thompson, United States Marshal Service," he said, his voice carrying an authority that Pike's had always lacked. "I have been made aware of a situation involving the possible illegal detention of a citizen. I would like to speak with Miss O'Rourke. Now." Pike's bravado faltered. This was not part of the plan. He looked from the marshal's hard face to Eli's unyielding one, and he knew he was trapped. He tried one last time. "This is a local matter." "It stopped being a local matter when you put your hands on her," the marshal said. "Open the cell, Pike, or I will open it for you. And then I will put you inside it with these." He held up a pair of government-issue handcuffs. They're steel clean and bright, a stark contrast to the rusty, pitted cuffs hanging on a peg on Pike's wall. Defeated, Pike lumbered to his feet, took a key from his desk, and unlocked the door to one of the two cells at the back of the office. May stood there, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She had the portfolio clutched in one hand. She walked out of the cell, her gaze fixed on Eli. The first thing she did was walk past him, past the marshal, to the doorway where Jonah stood half hidden behind Mrs. Gable. She knelt down and took his small hand in hers. "Thank you for coming for me," she whispered. Jonah just nodded, his eyes shining. May stood up and turned to Eli. She did not touch him. She did not need to. Her eyes met his across the small, lamp-lit room, and she gave him a single, solemn nod. It was a promise. It was an alliance. It was a declaration of trust that no words could ever capture. They had their proof, they had their witness, and they had each other. The real fight had just begun. The county courthouse in Prescott was not a grand hall of justice, but a simple, oversized wooden box built to hold the territory's fledgling attempts at order. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, nervous sweat, and the dry, dusty scent of old paper. Sunlight streamed through the tall, dirty windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust in its shafts. The room was packed, every bench filled with the citizens of Dust Hollow and the surrounding ranches, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, quiet support, and simmering prejudice. They fanned themselves with folded papers and hats, the rustling sound a constant, whispery counterpoint to the drone of a fly buzzing against a window pane. May and Eli sat at a table to the right of the judge's bench. They did not speak, but sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a small, united front against the weight of the room. Across the aisle sat their adversaries, Mr. Harrow, looking cool and unconcerned in a tailored suit, conferred quietly with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man from back east named Sterling. Sheriff Caleb Pike sat beside them, his bulk overflowing his chair, his face a blotchy red, a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. And at the end of their table, looking small and cornered, was Silas Crowley. He stared at his hands, refusing to meet May's gaze. Judge Miller, a man whose face seemed to have been carved from weathered granite, presided over the hearing. He was old, his movements slow, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He banged his gavel once, the sound cracking through the room like a dry twig. "This hearing will come to order," he announced, his voice a gravelly rumble. "We are here to hear the preliminary arguments regarding the contested claim to the property known as Spring Mercy." Harrow's lawyer, Sterling, rose smoothly to his feet. "Your Honor, we can dispense with this matter quickly. My client, Mr. Harrow, holds a legally executed deed for the property in question, signed by its previous administrator, Mr. Silas Crowley. The opposing claim is based on little more than a young woman's sentimental attachment and a fundamental misunderstanding of the law." "A misunderstanding?" Mr. Sterling Judge Miller asked, his eyes narrowing. "Indeed, Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured toward May. "While one might sympathize with the girl's position, territorial law is quite clear. A woman's legal and financial affairs are the province of her husband or male guardian. Miss O'Rourke has no legal standing to bring this claim on her own." A low murmur went through the crowd. This was the argument they understood, the one that aligned with the old, familiar order of things. Before the judge could respond, Marshal Thompson, who stood near the judge's bench, spoke up. "That is not correct, Counselor," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unshakable authority. "The territorial revisions of 1885, Statute 3, Section 4, explicitly grants unmarried women and widows full rights to inherit, own, and dispose of property without the consent of a male guardian. I believe the court will find Miss O'Rourke has every right to be here." Sterling's smirk faltered. He shot a venomous look at the marshal, but he had been beaten on a point of law, and he knew it. Judge Miller's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "The marshal is correct," he said. "The claimant has standing. Proceed with your evidence. Miss O'Rourke." May's hands were trembling as she stood. She placed the worn leather portfolio on the table, but it was Eli who spoke first. "Your Honor, before Miss O'Rourke presents her claim, we ask the court to consider evidence of a criminal conspiracy surrounding this entire affair." He nodded to the marshal. Thompson stepped forward and placed the small, black ledger on the judge's bench. "This was recovered from the office of Sheriff Caleb Pike," he announced. "It appears to be a detailed record of illicit payments made by Mr. Harrow to the sheriff in exchange for favorable treatment and legal interference." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Pike surged to his feet, his face apoplectic. "That is a lie. That book was stolen. It is inadmissible." "Sit down, Sheriff," Judge Miller commanded, his voice like stone. He opened the ledger, his eyes scanning a page. The silence in the room was absolute. "This will be entered as evidence," the judge said finally, his gaze resting on Pike with cold fury. "Now, Miss O'Rourke." May took a deep breath, her hands flat on the table to still their shaking. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at the whispers and the stares. Some people, she noticed, who had once gossiped about her, now looked down at their laps, a faint flush of shame on their cheeks. Others, however, still looked on with disdain, their gazes flicking to Eli, the judgment of his mixed blood clear in their eyes. She ignored them all and focused on the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice a little shaky at first, "my claim is based on the last will and testament of my mother, Eleanor O'Rourke. She left her property, including the land with the spring. To me, my stepfather, Silas Crowley, was to act only as a steward of that property until I came of age. Sterling was on his feet again. An assertion with no proof. We have a signed deed. Where is this supposed will? My mother was not a woman of legal papers, May said, but she was a woman of letters. I have here a letter she wrote to her sister, shortly after I was born. She opened the portfolio and carefully removed the fragile, yellowed pages. In it, she states her intentions for the property, and it was witnessed. She handed the letter to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Sterling laughed out loud. A personal letter. Your Honor, this is preposterous. That could have been written yesterday. That is where you are wrong. Counselor, a crisp voice called out from the audience. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stood up, her back ramrod straight. I can attest to the age of that document. Order, the judge barked. Mrs. Gable, approach the bench. The widow walked to the front, her face a mask of stern resolve. Your Honor, she said, Eleanor O'Rourke was a dear friend. After her death, that man, she pointed a trembling finger at Silas, sold off nearly everything she owned, but Eleanor had given me copies of some of her letters to family for safekeeping years ago. I have kept them in my store's ledger book ever since. She produced the folded, brittle page she had torn from her own book. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, they are the same. That letter of May's is genuine, and it is nearly 22 years old. The judge examined the two documents, holding them up to the light. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. More importantly, Your Honor, May continued, her voice gaining strength, is the matter of the signatures. She walked to the judge's bench and pointed, This is my stepfather's signature, as a witness, from 22 years ago. And if you compare it to the signature on the deed Mr. Harrow has presented, you will see it is a poor forgery at best. The two documents were laid side by side. The difference was undeniable. One was the confident script of a younger man. The other was the shaky, blotted scrawl of a desperate drunkard trying to imitate it. Silas finally broke. He slumped in his chair, a low groan escaping his lips. He was a ruined man. Sterling, seeing his case collapsing, tried one last, desperate tactic. He turned on May, his voice a cruel sneer. Tell me, Miss O'Rourke, is it not true that you are living under the roof of Mr. Mercer, a man to whom you are not related? A man of questionable breeding, what is the nature of your arrangement with him? Perhaps he is the one who concocted this elaborate scheme. The ugly insinuation hung in the hot, stale air. Before Eli could rise, his face a thundercloud, May answered, her voice ringing with a cold, clear anger. The name is O'Rourke. Sir, she said, her pronunciation perfect. And my arrangement with Mr. Mercer is one of employment. I work for my keep, unlike some. I do not sell what is not mine to sell. She looked directly at Silas, and for the first time, tears welled in her eyes. But she did not let them fall. When my mother died, this man sold her medical instruments for liquor. He sold the tools she used to save lives in this town so that he could sit in a saloon. The only thing he could not sell was her land, and I am here to see that he never does. Her voice cracked on the last words, raw with the years of grief and anger. The courtroom was silent, the force of her quiet dignity silencing the whispers and the scorn. A few of the women in the crowd were openly weeping. Judge Miller had seen enough. He held up a hand. This is a preliminary hearing, he said, his voice resonating with finality. But enough evidence has been presented to warrant immediate action. He picked up a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and began to write. The scratching of the nib was the only sound in the room. Pending a full trial, the property known as Spring Mercy and its associated land is hereby sealed. No party shall access or draw water from it until this matter is fully resolved. A warrant is issued for the immediate arrest of Sheriff Caleb Pike on charges of obstruction of justice and accepting bribes. The territorial authorities will be notified to pursue Silas Crowley for his outstanding debts and his role in this fraud. He finished writing, sprinkled sand on the ink to dry it, and then picked up his seal. He pressed the heavy brass emblem into a pool of melted red wax at the bottom of the page. The symbol of the law, clear and sharp, a promise of order in a chaotic world. The creaking of the old wooden chairs seemed to whine in protest as Marshal Thompson stepped forward and clamped the steel handcuffs on Caleb Pike's wrists. The disgraced sheriff looked stunned, his face slack with disbelief. May and Eli watched, a profound sense of relief washing over them. It was not over, but it was a victory. They had faced the town, faced the law, and the truth had won. They left the courthouse and stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. The crowd parted for them, some offering quiet congratulations, others turning away, their allegiances still with the power that had been. Across the street, standing in the shadows of an awning, Mr. Harrow watched them go. His face was not angry. It was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. He had lost a battle of paper and words. But there were other, older ways to settle disputes in this country. He looked past the town, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge that marked the Mercer land. He thought of the fine horses, the sturdy barn, the dry timber of the corrals, and in his mind he saw a cleansing fire, a fire that could burn away deeds and ledgers and evidence, leaving nothing behind but ash. The legal victory felt thin and brittle, like a skin of ice on a deep river. They had won the hearing, but the source of their life, Spring Mercy, was sealed by a piece of paper and a blob of red wax. A strange, tense quiet settled over the ranch. They had the law on their side, but the law was in Prescott, a long day's ride away, out here under the vast, indifferent sky. They were still on their own. The night of the fire began with a deceptive calm. A dry wind whispered through the cottonwoods, a restless, fitful sound that promised no rain. Eli stood on the porch, staring into the darkness, a feeling of unease coiling in his gut. May was inside, putting Jonah to bed, her soft voice a low murmur that was almost lost in the rustle of the wind. The first sign was the smell, acrid and sharp. It was not the familiar scent of wood smoke from the cookhouse chimney. This was the hungry smell of hay and dry timber catching fire. At the same moment, a frantic, terrified whinny cut through the night from the direction of the main barn. Eli was moving before the sound had fully registered. "Fire!" he yelled, his voice a raw command that brought men tumbling out of the bunkhouse, pulling on boots and grabbing buckets. A sickening orange glow was blooming against the black sky, pulsing like a malevolent heart. The main barn, the product of a year's hard labor, the heart of the entire ranch, was burning. Flames licked up the dry wooden walls, and a column of thick, black smoke boiled into the night. The wind, which had been a mere whisper, chose that moment to gain strength, gusting from the east and pushing the flames not away, but directly toward the other stables, the corrals, and the main house itself. The scene descended into a controlled chaos. Eli directed the men, his voice sharp and clear above the roar, forming a bucket brigade from the well. May was there, her face smudged with soot, her sleeves rolled up, passing buckets with a steady rhythm, her eyes scanning the men for any sign of injury. The heat was a physical blow, driving them back, and the air was a choking mix of smoke and ash. They managed to get the horses from the nearest corrals out into the far pasture, their eyes rolling with terror, their screams adding to the hellish symphony. Eli did a quick, desperate head count of the animals milling in the distant moonlight. "We are missing one." A hand yelled, "Daisy, the mare!" A cold dread, sharper and hotter than any flame, pierced Eli's heart. Daisy was Jonah's horse, the gentle mare he had helped raise from a foal. And in the same instant the man spoke the horse's name. Eli realized the other, more terrible truth. "Where is Jonah?" he roared, his voice cracking with a fear he had not felt since the day he had buried his wife. No one answered. The men looked at each other, their faces pale in the firelight. Then young Jimmy spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw him. I saw him run toward the barn a minute ago. He was crying about Daisy. He said he had to get her out." For a single paralyzing moment, Eli could not move. The world narrowed to the roaring, collapsing inferno that held his nephew. His discipline, his control, all of it evaporated, replaced by a primal, animal terror. He was about to charge blindly into the smoke and flames, a suicidal act of love and desperation. A hand grabbed his arm, small but strong. It was May. Her face was streaked with ash, but her eyes were clear and fiercely intelligent. "Not like that." "Eli," she shouted to be heard over the fire. "You will never find him. We have to be smarter." "He is in there," Eli choked out, the words tearing at his throat. "I know," she said, her grip tightening. "So we get him out. Listen to me. You go in the main doors. Keep low. The smoke will be thinner near the floor. I will go around the back. The old water pipe for the trough runs along the back wall. I will bang on it with a rock. The noise will spook the mare. Drive her away from the sound. It will drive her towards you, toward the open doors. Do you understand?" It was a desperate, brilliant plan, a pincer movement against the fire itself. He looked at her, at the unwavering resolve in her face, and nodded, his mind snapping back into focus. He plunged into the barn, a wet bandana tied over his face. The heat was like a physical wall, and the smoke was a blinding, stinging fog. Timbers groaned overhead, and the roar of the flames was a deafening, all-consuming beast. He crawled forward, yelling Jonah's name, his voice a raw, hopeless sound in the inferno. May ran, her lungs burning, around the long side of the building to the relative dark of the back wall. The metal of the water pipe was already hot to the touch. She found a heavy rock and began to beat on the pipe, a desperate, rhythmic clang that was both a signal and a prayer. Clang, clang, clang. Drive them out. Drive them to him. Inside the barn, through the swirling smoke, Eli heard it, a dull, metallic banging from the far side of the building. And then he heard another sound, the panicked scramble of hooves. A shape materialized in the gloom, a dark shadow moving toward the light of the main doors. It was the mare, Daisy, and clinging to her mane, his small body racked with coughs, was Jonah. Eli surged forward, grabbing the boy and pulling him from the horse's back just as the mare bolted out into the relative safety of the night. He crushed Jonah to his chest, burying his face in the boy's smoky hair, his body trembling with a relief so profound it was painful. As he stumbled out of the burning barn, carrying the boy, 3 figures stepped out of the shadows cast by the bunkhouse. It was Harrow and 2 of his hired thugs. They held lanterns and a can of coal oil, the tools of their crime still in their hands. "Well, Mercer," Harrow said, his voice calm, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Looks like you're having a bit of bad luck." Before Eli could respond, another voice, cold and hard as steel. "Cut through the night. Drop the lanterns. Harrow." "You?" Marshal John Thompson and one of his deputies stepped out from behind the corner of the house, their pistols drawn and steady. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Then Harrow, his face contorting in a snarl of rage, hurled his lit lantern not at Eli, but at a pile of dry hay near the stable, creating a fresh explosion of flame to cover his escape. He turned and ran, his men scattering into the darkness. The marshal's deputy went after one of the thugs. The marshal stayed, his gun trained on the other. Eli, his mind a white-hot fury, handed the still coughing Jonah to May, who had just come running from the back of the barn. "Get him to the house," he commanded. Then he took off after Harrow. Harrow was fast, but he was a city man. Eli was powered by righteous rage and a lifetime of running on this land. He caught up to him in the dry arroyo where May had nearly been lost to the flood. He tackled him, and they went down in a cloud of dust and a flurry of limbs. Harrow was strong, but Eli was stronger. He subdued him, his hands closing around the man's throat. But as he looked down at Harrow's terrified, gasping face, He saw the image of Silas, of Pike, of all the men who used brute force and intimidation as their only tools, and he knew he would not be one of them. He released his grip. He looked around and saw a length of braided leather rein hanging from a nearby fence post, one he had plaited himself just a month before. He grabbed it and, with swift, expert motions, bound Harrow's hands behind his back. He would be brought in not by a bullet, but by the very symbol of Eli's honest trade, his own skill and honor. It was then that a section of the barn's main roof, weakened by the fire, gave way with a deafening crash. A heavy, burning crossbeam, a foot thick and 20 feet long, cartwheeled through the air and slammed into the ground near them. A smaller, still smoldering piece of it broke off and struck Eli high on the shoulder. The impact drove him to his knees, a sharp, sickening crack echoing in the night, an agony so intense it was white-hot shot through his arm and chest. May saw him go down. She left Jonah in the care of Mrs. Gable, who had just arrived in a wagon filled with women from the town, and ran to him. The marshal now had Harrow in custody. May knelt beside Eli, her face a calm, professional mask that betrayed none of the terror she felt. "Your shoulder," she said, her hands gently probing the joint. "It is dislocated." He gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. Jonah, seeing his uncle hurt, ran to May's side and wrapped his small arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. "Thomas! Jimmy! Hold him steady!" May commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. The ranch hands, their faces grim, did as she asked. "Eli, this is going to hurt," with a smooth, practiced motion. She braced her foot and pulled, rotating his arm until the joint popped back into place with a sound that made the grown men around them wince. Eli cried out, a raw, strangled sound, then slumped against her, the pain receding into a dull, throbbing ache. Jonah held on to her, a small, trembling anchor in the swirling world of smoke and pain. A family, forged in fire and flood, held together in the ruins. And then, as if the heavens themselves were rendering a verdict, the rain began to fall. Fat, heavy drops at first, sizzling as they hit the hot embers and sending up plumes of white steam. Then it became a downpour, a cool, cleansing torrent that beat down the flames, soaked the dry earth, and washed the soot from their faces. The fire, which had threatened to consume everything, was extinguished by a mercy from the sky. Through the downpour, a new sound began to emerge, a low gurgle at first, then a steady, musical trickle. It was the sound of water. The rain, soaking into the parched land, was replenishing the aquifer. Spring mercy, the source of their struggle, was beginning to flow again. May looked up and saw that they were no longer alone. The neighbors, the same people who had whispered and stared, were there, working alongside Eli's men, their faces grim with shared purpose. Mrs. Gable was directing a group of women, saving saddles and harnesses from the tack room, and the old reverend, his face streaked with soot, walked over and gently draped his own coat over May's shoulders as she knelt in the mud, holding Eli and the boy. Justice, she realized, did not just come from a man in a black robe. It came from the hands of a community, from neighbors who, when faced with the stark realities of fire and ruin, chose to stand together. The rain fell on the ashes, a baptism for the land and for the hearts of its people, washing away the old and preparing the ground for whatever was to come next. Dawn broke over a landscape of black bones and blessed mud. The skeleton of the main barn stood stark against a soft gray sky, its charred timbers like the ribs of a great beast that had fallen in battle. The air, thick with the smell of wet ash and scorched pine, was also alive with a new sound, the clear, steady music of spring mercy, running stronger and fuller than it had in a year. The fire had taken the heart of the ranch, but the rain had given back its soul. They were not alone in the cleanup. By sunrise, wagons from the neighboring ranches began to arrive, not with curious onlookers, but with men carrying axes and saws, and women carrying baskets of food and blankets. The community, which had stood by in judgment, had finally chosen a side. They had chosen their own. They worked all day. A silent, purposeful army, clearing debris, assessing the damage, and offering the quiet comfort of shared labor. Marshal Thompson returned in the late afternoon. His horse splattered with mud from the ride to Prescott and back. He brought with him the final pieces of the legal puzzle. Mr. Harrow and his men were in federal custody. Their attempt at arson, the final, irrefutable proof of their conspiracy. Caleb Pike had been stripped of his office, his tin star now sitting in a dusty evidence box. And Silas Crowley, upon hearing of the fire and Harrow's arrest, had vanished. He had slipped out of his shack in the dead of night, leaving behind nothing but empty bottles and a legacy of shame. He was a ghost, a bad memory that had finally faded from the land. The marshal also carried a thick envelope sealed with the official stamp of the territorial court. Inside was the final, adjudicated deed to Spring Mercy. The title now unequivocally and permanently in the name of May O'Rourke. Tucked in with it was a second document, a new one, drawn up by a Prescott lawyer that morning and signed by both May and Eli. It was a formal agreement, a partnership that granted the Mercer Ranch permanent and co-equal rights to the water. It was a model of symbiosis, a legal reflection of the truth that had been forged in flood and fire they could not survive without each other. That evening, the exhaustion settled in, deep and bone-weary. The neighbors had departed, promising to return with lumber and tools the next day. A temporary shelter had been fashioned for the horses, and the ranch was quiet. In the main house, May was heating water on the stove to prepare a fresh bandage for Eli's shoulder. The dislocation had left behind a deep, angry bruise that painted his skin in shades of purple and black. Eli sat at the kitchen table, his arm resting in a sling she had fashioned from a clean linen sheet. He watched her move, her actions efficient and sure. She brought the basin of warm water and the clean bandages to the table. "All right," she said, her voice soft. "Let us get this old one off." She began to unwrap the bandage, her fingers light and professional. When she had removed it, she paused, her hand hovering just above his bruised skin. He looked at her, at the quiet concentration in her face, and the memory of the line cabin, of her whispered words, was as real as the table between them. He took a slow breath. "May," he said, his voice low, "is it all right?" She stopped, her eyes meeting his. He was not asking about the pain of the wound. He was asking for permission. He was honoring the boundaries she had set, acknowledging the history that stood between them. He was giving her a choice. A slow, gentle smile touched her lips. She gave a small nod. "Yes, Eli, it is all right." Her fingers, warm from the water, finally touched his skin. It was not a professional, clinical touch. It was a connection, deliberate and gentle, a current, quiet and warm, passed between them. He did not pull away. He leaned into her touch, a silent surrender. She worked slowly, cleaning the wound, her movements careful and soothing. He watched her face, the way a loose strand of hair fell across her cheek, the serious set of her mouth. When she was finished, she began to wrap the new, clean bandage around his shoulder. As she leaned closer to tie the knot, he could smell the faint scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. She looked up, and their faces were only inches apart. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but she also saw something new, something open and vulnerable. He saw the strength in hers, but also a softness that had not been there before. A quiet laugh, small and breathy, escaped her lips. "What is it?" he murmured. "Nothing," she said, her own smile widening. "It is just quiet." He knew what she meant. The storms, both outside and inside, had finally passed. He smiled back, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. The touch had happened. The boundary had been crossed, not with a crash, but with a quiet, consensual step. And on the other side, They had found not danger, but a gentle, sunlit peace. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, the steady, healing beat of reconstruction. The broken survey stakes that had once scarred the land were pulled up. Eli and young Jimmy sharpened the ends, and May used them to build a frame for climbing beans in a small garden she started near her cabin. A broken piece of rain, the same one Eli had used to tie up Harrow, was found by Jonah, who tied it into a lapsang bow and hung it on the door of the temporary stable. A child's simple, profound act of transforming a tool of conflict into an object of beauty. Jonah, who had been a silent, watchful shadow, now seemed to fill the ranch with his presence. He had faced the fire and come out the other side, his courage earning him a new, unspoken status among the men. He slept soundly through the night now, the old nightmares finally chased away. One evening, after a particularly long day of helping to sort and stack new lumber, he marched up to May with his hands on his hips. "I have worked hard," he announced with grave seriousness. "I believe I have earned my wages." May hid a smile. "Oh, you have you? And what is the going rate for a lumber sorter these days?" "1 whole apple pie," he declared. She laughed, a full, happy sound. "That is a high price. I can pay you in 1 story, 2, if the work was exceptional." "Mph," he said, pretending to consider it. "All right, but it has to be a good one." Later, as May sat on the porch steps reading to him from a tattered copy of a book, Eli came and sat nearby, leaning against a post, his injured shoulder propped carefully. He listened to the rise and fall of her voice and the boy's occasional, sleepy questions. When May finished, and Jonah's head was nodding, Eli went inside. He came back out with a small bowl of stewed apples left over from supper. He placed it beside Jonah, and with a spoon, he drizzled a slow, golden ribbon of honey over the top. It was a quiet gesture, a silent amendment to their contract, a sweetness added just because he could. The shift in the world was not just on the ranch. May's actions at the courthouse and the fire had not gone unnoticed. One Sunday after church, a woman who had once whispered about her approached her hesitantly. "Miss O'Rourke," she said, twisting her gloves in her hands. "My boy, he is struggling with his letters. I was wondering, if you had the time, if you might be willing to help him." Soon, another family asked, and then another. A small, informal school began to take shape in the afternoons on the porch of the Mercantile, with Mrs. Gable presiding like a proud godmother. May, with her patient manner and clear explanations, had become a teacher, with her knowledge of herbs and healing. She also began dispensing remedies from a small, clean corner of the store, a practice the community now welcomed with gratitude instead of suspicion. She had found her voice, not just to defend her own rights, but to help and to heal. She had become her mother's daughter in full. Eli watched it all, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He saw the woman who had arrived in his wagon, trembling and defiant, transform into a respected cornerstone of the town. He, too, had been transformed. He had learned to accept the help of his neighbors, to lean on the strength of his community. He was no longer the solitary man who kept the world at arm's length. One evening, he stood watching the sunset paint the sky, the new, unfinished frame of the barn silhouetted against the vibrant colors. He thought of his late wife, Sarah. The memory was still there, a part of him, but the sharp, stabbing pain had softened into a gentle, quiet ache of remembrance. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling he had thought was lost to him forever. He looked toward the house, where a warm lamplight now glowed in the kitchen window. He could see May's silhouette as she moved about inside. He thought of her courage, her intelligence, her quiet, unyielding strength. He thought of her hand on his shoulder, of her easy laughter, of the way Jonah's entire world now revolved around her. The thought of marriage, which had once been an impossible, terrifying prospect, now felt as natural and as necessary as the rain after a long drought. But he would not rush. He would not assume. She had fought too hard for her independence, for her right to choose. He would have to ask. He would have to do it properly, in a way that honored not only the memory of the wife he had lost, but the incredible strength of the woman he had found. A month passed. The new barn rose from the ashes, its fresh pine timbers smelling of sweat and sap and stubborn hope. It was a testament not just to Eli's resilience, but to the community that had rallied to his side. The work was hard, but the days were filled with the easy camaraderie of a shared purpose. The ranch was healing, and so were its people. On the day the last roof beam was hoisted into place, Eli declared a celebration. It was not a grand affair, just a simple supper held in the open air as the late afternoon sun softened the edges of the world. The families who had helped rebuild were there, their children chasing each other through the new grass that was already sprouting in the fire-blackened soil. The air was filled with the sizzle of beef cooking over an open pit, the sound of a fiddle playing a cheerful tune, and the low, happy murmur of conversation. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear when Eli stood up. He did not raise his voice, but a respectful quiet fell over the small crowd. Jonah, who had been playing near the creek, came and stood beside him, slipping his small hand into Eli's. "I do not have many words," Eli began, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "But I need to say thank you to all of you. You did not have to come. You did not have to help, but you did. You stood with us, and you helped us build this place back from the ashes. This barn, it is not mine. It belongs to all of us." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors, friends who had once been strangers. "When the fire came, I thought I had lost everything, but I was wrong. A man who stands alone has nothing. A man who stands with his community has everything that matters." His gaze came to rest on May. She stood near the cook fire, a cup of coffee held in her hands, her face illuminated by the soft, warm light. The fiddle music had stopped, and the only sound was the gentle, ceaseless bubbling of spring mercy as it flowed past them. "There is one person I need to thank most of all," Eli continued, his voice growing softer, more personal. "When May O'Rourke first came to this ranch, she was a stranger seeking justice, but she brought more than a legal claim. She brought a strength and a courage I had forgotten existed. She held this place together when it was falling apart. She is the one who keeps the heart of this ranch beating." He gently pulled Jonah to stand in front of him, his hands resting on the boy's small shoulders. He looked directly at May, his eyes dark and serious in the twilight. "She is the one who brought my family back to life." Then, slowly, deliberately, he went down on one knee in the soft, damp grass. A collective, soft gasp went through the women in the crowd. He was not looking at them. He was looking only at May. He did not have a fancy box. He simply opened his hand. Resting on his calloused palm was a simple silver ring. It was not polished and bright, but had the soft, matte luster of old silver. A delicate one continuous wave was engraved all the way around the band. "May," he said, his voice husky, "I am not a man of fancy words, but I know what I feel. My life was a half-empty house, and you walked in and made it whole." He took a breath. "I am asking if you would be my wife. I am asking if you would let us be your family." He glanced down at Jonah, who was looking up at May with wide, hopeful eyes. "You do not have to answer now. You can take all the time you need. Your answer is for me, and me alone." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed you could hear the stars turning in the sky. Then Jonah, unable to contain himself a second longer, piped up in a loud, curious whisper that carried to every corner of the yard. "Does this mean you will be my uncle, Pa?" A ripple of gentle laughter broke the tension. "Mrs." Gable wiped a tear from her eye with the back of her hand. The fiddler, taking his cue, began to play a soft, sweet waltz. May walked toward him. She did not rush. She moved with the same quiet, deliberate grace she had shown in every crisis. She stopped in front of him, her eyes searching his face in the growing darkness. She saw no ownership in his gaze, no demand. She saw only a humble, heartfelt question. She looked down at the ring. "Is that?" "The nails from the old barn," he said, his voice a murmur. "I had the smith in Prescott melt them down. I wanted a piece of what was, to be part of what could be." She looked from the ring, a symbol of rebirth, to the man kneeling before her. She had come to this land seeking to reclaim a piece of her past. She had fought for a deed, for a spring, for the memory of her mother. But somewhere along the way, in the dust and the danger, she had found something else entirely. She had found a future. She had found a home. She reached out and gently touched his cheek. "I do not need time to think. Eli," she whispered, her voice for him alone. "I already have my answer." She knelt in front of him, so they were eye to eye. "I have already chosen." He did not put the ring on her finger. Not yet. That was for later. For a private moment. Instead, he simply reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. May leaned forward and gently, hesitantly, rested her head against his good shoulder. He brought his other arm around her, holding her in a loose, warm embrace that was not about possession, but about sanctuary. It was a quiet promise of shelter from all the storms the world could muster. In the days that followed, a new order settled over the land, as solid and as real as the new timbers of the barn. The flow of spring mercy was a constant, soothing presence, a symbol of the life and love that now nourished the ranch. A newly plated rein hung by the door of the main house, not for breaking horses, but as a reminder of the bonds of trust and honor. And inside, hanging on the wall in a simple wooden frame Eli had made, was the official court document, the red wax seal, a small, bright declaration of a new kind of law, a law based not on power, but on truth. The change rippled out into the town of Dust Hollow itself. The talk in the saloon was less of cynical deal-making and more of rebuilding. The sermons in the church began to touch on themes of forgiveness and community, and the whistle of the train, once a harbinger of ruthless progress, now sounded more like a promise of connection, of a future they could all build together. The town was learning, slowly, that a woman's worth was not determined by a man, and that a man's strength was not measured by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. The shadow of the past would always be there. Silas might one day return. Other Harrows would surely come, with their money and their greed. But May and Eli were no longer alone. They had saved themselves by choosing to stand together, by forging a family not from blood, but from respect, courage, and a shared, stubborn hope. They had found their justice, not in a single verdict, but in the slow, patient work of building a life. As evening settled over the valley, the sound of the wind sweeping across the dry plains was a low, mournful sigh. But on the Mercer Ranch, it was answered by a different sound, a stronger sound. It was the clear, constant, life-giving music of the spring. In this land, the strongest thing was not a gun, but a word kept true. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.